Good morning, everyone. All right, that is what we need. We need high energy because we are about to listen to a bunch of academics talk about research. All right, woo! Yes, okay. I was thinking about, boy, it was interesting, our friends at ExcelinEd, with the schedule, they put that amazing panel together that we just watched with these incredible stories and so much heart talking about school choice. And now we have to follow that by talking all about the wonkety stuff, the research. So if you came here hoping to hear more inspirational stories about school choice, we are going to be disappointing you. Although I'm sure these guys could tell some inspirational stories, if we really push them. My name is Mike Petrilli. I am president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. We are an education policy think tank out of Washington, D.C. We also do on-the-ground work in the great state of Ohio. And I'm very honored to be here today and get to play moderator. Really, my role is going to be very light at the beginning, which is just to pass the baton to these guys who are going to go through the academic research on school choice. And then once that's done, we'll get into a moderated discussion and get your questions in there as well. The main goal of this session is to help all of us have a clear and fair and nuanced understanding of what the research on school choice says and does not say. I don't think I have to tell anybody here that oftentimes research on school choice becomes something of a caricature, certainly in the press and even in the public policy discussion. Certainly I read and hear all the time that people say that, all the recent research is showing that school choice is not effective, private school choice is not effective. And that is simply not true. But the real story is more interesting and more complicated, and we're going to hear from these scholars to help us understand that. And to look at many different issues, to look at student achievement as one key factor, and is something that I know personally I still believe is incredibly important, is to look at the impact these programs are having on the achievement of the students participating in them. But other impacts as well. What are the competitive effects of school choice? What are the long-term impacts that we are seeing for students participating in these programs? What is the impact on segregation in our schools, on civic knowledge and civic participation? If we step back, we all know that education, our schools, they serve lots of different purposes. And certainly preparing kids for success in post-secondary education or for the world of work, two very important things, but also preparing our young people to be citizens and to take over the mantle of leadership someday. So when we think about the big purposes of education, we have to also think about how we can study the impact of programs like school choice on all of those different purposes. So that is what we're going to get into today. And we do have a fantastic panel, some of the best scholars in the country who have spent their careers studying this issue. We're going to start with Dr. Patrick Wolf. He is the 21st Century Chair in School Choice, I like that title, at the University of Arkansas Department of Education Reform. And Pat has been doing some of the most important marquee work on school choice for a long time, including a big federal study of the DC Voucher program once upon a time. And Pat's going to go through lots of different aspects of the research literature. Then we've got Dr. Matthew Chingos, Education Policy Director at the Urban Institute, also a colleague of mine on the editorial board at Education Next. Matt has done several recent analyses of Florida's tax credit scholarship program. He's going to talk about that and other parts of the research literature. And then finally, Dr. Ben Scafidi, the Education Economics Center Director at Kennesaw State University. And Ben has done, again, a lot of work that looks beyond just the question of test scores and academic achievement and gets into some of these other issues that I mentioned. So again, they're going to run through some PowerPoints. I have told them they have got to make it interesting and engaging or else I'm ripping them off the stage, okay? And we have to compete with your smartphones, and we want to make sure that everybody's really paying attention to this research. These PowerPoints will be made available, right, so that when you go home and you are talking to constituents or to the press or to your other members of your legislatures, and people claim, well, doesn't the research show ... you can say, hey, let's look at the holistic picture here. And let's make sure everybody is on the same page when it comes to the facts. So, myths versus facts. Just give us the facts, Pat. Here we go. Pat Wolf, please welcome him to the stage.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I'm delighted to be here to talk about the academic, civic, and integration effects of private school choice. I need to start with a disclaimer. This is university policy. I must announce to you that I am not a spokesmodel for the University of Arkansas. Now, you all could have figured that out on your own, but this is something I have to do. Looking at the audience, it does look like the audience for a Razorback football game these days. And I will ask you, if you're interested in coaching our team, see me afterwards. So you're probably thinking that Wolf drew the short stick for this panel because there's been, as Mike alluded to, there's been a big buzz in the policy sphere of school choice regarding how terrible school choice is for participating students, non-participating students, and for our country. Here are a few examples of what's been said over the last decade about private school choice, really sweeping negative claims about the effects of choice from Saul Stern of the right-leaning Manhattan Institute, by Tim Walker of the National Education Association, obviously anti-reform, anti-National Education Association, and by Diane Ravitch, who is from Mars, as far as I can figure out. And when you look particularly at the Ravitch quote, there is no evidence that students in voucher schools get higher test scores. No evidence. She's saying not a single study has ever found that students participating in private school choice benefit academically. So I'm going to walk you through the studies that exist, and I'm going to introduce you to a classification scheme that I use to distinguish the most rigorous studies from the least rigorous studies. And it all has to do with this problem we have in social science called the self-selection problem. What that means is that people who are interested in participating in new programs tend to have a bunch of other characteristics. They're more motivated, they're more desperate, all kinds of things that we can't really carefully measure that distinguish them from people who don't participate. And so if we don't account for those factors, we can have what's called self-selection bias in our analysis. We won't be able to disentangle the effects of the program from innate characteristics of the people who choose to participate. There are various strategies to disentangle those important factors. The best one is random assignment through scholarship lotteries or voucher lotteries. That allows gold standard evaluations that are experimental, where we are comparing two groups of students who both wanted to participate. One group, by the luck of the draw, won the lottery, gets to participate, the other doesn't. That's gold standard, and we use them exclusively whenever we can. If we can't do lotteries, then we use silver standard studies, which match students on observed characteristics and track their growth over time. That's silver. Bronze is when we simply introduce some control variables for a few characteristics of students we think matter. Those are not nearly as good as silver or gold, but they're at least informative if they're done properly. But really, many of the comparisons that are made, that are called research studies and that are made in the policy sphere in school choice, don't do any of these things. They just present uncontrolled comparisons of average outcomes for choice students versus non-choice students. And these really are disqualified from consideration, from serious consideration in my world, my academic world, and should also be disqualified in your world. So only bronze standard studies or better will be reviewed here. Look for the medal. It will designate how rigorous the group of studies are being considered. We're looking at evaluations of government-run school voucher programs or privately run tax credit scholarship programs. Those are the two forms of private school choice that have been evaluated regarding their test score effects and their civic effects. Positive choice findings overall are highlighted by forest green. So if you see dark green highlighting a study, that means it found that school choice had a clear positive effect on participants overall. If there was no clear effect overall, but certain key subgroups of students clearly benefited from the choice program, then those studies will be highlighted in a lighter green. If there were no significant effects, either way, positive or negative, those studies will appear in yellow. And if there were clear negative effects of choice on student outcomes, as many people have claimed over the last few years, those studies will be highlighted in red. So it's a stoplight coding thing, green, yellow, red, with green as the best. So we're just coming out of Thanksgiving. When I think of Thanksgiving, I think about pie. And so there are 4 ways to slice this pie. And that's about the size of a piece of pie that I usually eat for dessert. And we're going to look at participant achievement effects. We're going to look at the competitive effects of private school choice on students who don't participate. We're going to look at the civic effects of choice. And finally, the integration effects. So the achievement effects all appear as gold standard studies. We have 17 rigorous lottery-based school choice evaluations of the effects of private school choice on participating student test scores, so we limit our review to that. So if you've ever been to a state fair, and I know the state legislators here, you all have, I'm sure, but there's a dessert, I mean, there's a real dessert theme you can see in my presentation, but there's a dessert, it's a rainbow popsicle. And this kind of looks like a rainbow popsicle, right? But there is a ton of lime in that rainbow popsicle because so many rigorous random assignment studies have confirmed that private school choice has a positive effect on student test scores. 7 of them have found that overall for all participating groups of students. 4 of them have found that for key subgroups of students, especially African American students and those leaving public schools that were particularly low performing. 4 studies have found no significant effect of choice on test scores either way. And only 2 studies have reported clear negative effects of choice participation on student test scores. And another thing that's peculiar about these 2 studies is they only looked at results for students after a single year, after 1 year. And we all know, all of those of us who have studied school choice and deliver school choice, we know that that first year is a challenging year for students. That's the transitional year where they've left a public school with a certain curriculum and a certain set of expectations. They've entered a private school environment with very different expectations, very different curriculum, and students always lose ground in terms of test scores when they switch schools. So basically, these 2 negative studies are capturing the adjustment challenges of students in their first year and not necessarily the long-term stable effects of private school choice on student achievement. All of the other studies highlighted in this review look at student test score achievement more than 1 year after the switch. And they're all either neutral or positive in their findings. Let's move on to the competitive effects of school choice. So school choice critics argue that traditional public schools are fragile. They aren't capable of responding to competition. And so when you introduce competition into their environment through launching or expanding private school choice, that will place them on a death spiral. They will be robbed of students and unable to respond in a constructive way, and that will result in poor outcomes for the students, quote, left behind. Whereas supporters of private school choice argue that competition has a similar effect in the education space that it has in every other aspect of our life. It pressures individuals and organizations to deliver better outcomes for their customers in order to retain them. So there have been 24 studies. These are all silver standard studies because you can't randomly assign schools to exposure to competition or not exposure to competition. But there have been 24 silver standard studies of the competitive effects of private school choice. And it's really a rout. 23 of them clearly find that student test scores go up when traditional public schools are subject to competition from choice. There's one lonely study at the bottom by Green and Winters of the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program that found it had no competitive effect either way on student test scores of the students left behind. And that was by design, because the Opportunity Scholarship Program originally was designed to hold the traditional public schools harmless. They lost students to private schools, they kept the money. And so if there was no impact, if there is no loss associated with the competition, there also will be no response. And that's what we saw in the case of the OSP. But the other studies, 9 of Florida, several of Ohio, many of Milwaukee, some of Indiana, Louisiana, Maine, Vermont, all across the country, competition in education leads to better outcomes for the students who stay put in traditional public schools. But what about civic outcomes? I mean, we expect schools to do more than just improve student test score. And oftentimes the discussion is about how school choice is going to lead to a balkanization of our society. It's going to rip our society apart, and it won't adequately prepare students for their responsibilities as citizens. So there's a very serious charge against school choice. So I reviewed all of the academic studies that looked at the effect of private schooling on civic outcomes. And this includes political tolerance, it includes political knowledge and participation, voluntarism, patriotism, the full spectrum of civic dispositions that we want students to have once they've completed their education. And I coded all the findings, the individual findings in these studies, whether they whether the private schooling exposure led to higher outcomes or public schooling exposure led to higher outcomes. And here we see it's a clear win for private schooling. Among all the findings, 42 of them show that private schooling has a positive effect on civic outcomes. 28, there are no clear effects either way, and just 3 are negative. If we restrict it to the more rigorous empirical studies, it's still a clear win for private schooling. 19 positive effects, 18 null findings, and just 1 lonely negative. But then there's also racial integration. This has been a very hot topic, a very important concern in K-12 education over the last 100 years or so, is the idea that we really would like our students in our community to be educated in schools that are diverse racially, that aren't just uniform in terms of the racial composition of the student body. And much of education policy has really strived to accomplish better racial integrations in schools. So it's important to consider the effect that expanding or extending private school choice has on whether or not participating students experience greater or lesser racial integration in the schools they select. There have been 9 studies of this question, and again, it's a win for school choice. 8 of them find that the educational environments of students who participate in private school choice are better integrated by race in the private schools through choice than they were in the public schools through residential assignment. There's just one study of Milwaukee that found no net effect. The most recent study is one I did with 2 junior colleagues of the school voucher program in Louisiana, and we found clear evidence, and this was reported in Education Next, that the students participating in that voucher program made their own public schools they were leaving better integrated by transferring, and at least did as well or better in the integration of the private schools that they went to. So putting it all together, there are many high-quality studies of school choice out there, and the evidence shows that it improves both academic and non-academic outcomes for students who choose eventually, but you have to give school choice time to work out the adjustment period and really demonstrate its true effects. But for students left behind in traditional public schools, the effects are overwhelmingly positive on test score outcomes, and they are immediate. They happen the first year. Gains tend to be larger for African American students, and we haven't even considered the attainment and fiscal effects, which my colleagues will discuss going forward. So I just have to say, school choice is an Olympian success. That's a picture of me at the Beijing Olympics with all these gold standard studies around my neck. And if you want more information, please email me or visit the website for my research center at the University of Arkansas. Go Hogs.
All right. Woo. Let me change the script just a little bit. I want to push a little bit on something that you said, because in part because it's what all the people here, all of us hear all the time, and so we need to know how to respond to this. When you talk about the impact on the participants, you said you looked at all of the gold standard studies, and these are random assignment studies, and they were overwhelmingly found positive or some neutral effects. Can you talk a little bit about the silver standard studies? Because these are the ones that we hear about all the time. Some of them recent. One that we actually at Fordham commissioned in Ohio that was a rigorous but silver standard study that found some negative effects for participants in the school voucher programs. These tend to be studies of the large statewide programs. So tell us a little bit about those and how we should think about the evidence coming from those studies.
Sure. So the Ohio study by David Figlio got a lot of attention, and David used a technique called regression discontinuity design. It was the best he could do under the circumstances, but it just focuses at the most advantaged kids participating in the choice program who barely qualify. So they're sort of the high end. They have higher income than the typical choice student. And basically, David was able to determine that their outcomes, their test score outcomes, were slightly lower than the outcomes for students who completely missed the threshold. So who had slightly higher income, didn't qualify, came from slightly better schools. So David admitted in his report, he said, this is a very small sliver of participants, and it's most likely the choice participants who are least likely to benefit from choice. We find in all these other studies, the more disadvantaged a student is, the more likely that that type of student is going to realize test score gains from private school choice. So the study had a lot of serious limitations. David admitted that in his report, and it was really lost on most of the media who covered it, and so I think that's unfortunate. Another silver standard study was my longitudinal evaluation of the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program in the early 2000s. We had to use student matching, and we found no effects on test scores until the very last year. We did find an effect, and it's kind of interesting. Mike's been following this. That was the year that the Wisconsin legislature required that the testing of voucher students be high stakes. So until then, they were only taking a test to inform our research. That final year, the test score was reported publicly for the participating private schools, and that year there was a big jump in the score for the voucher students that moved them ahead of the comparison students. So you have this combination of a high-stakes test score effect and a voucher effect in that study. And then Chris Lubinsky, now at the University of Indiana, has done a lot of bronze standard studies of private school choice. Not private school choice, but just private schooling. And because he doesn't have random assignment and doesn't have access to these other techniques, he basically controls for different sets of variables under different circumstances until he finds a negative effect and then reports that. And in his research, he doesn't report any effects on reading because those are consistently positive for private schools. He only reports math effects, where private schools don't appear to be doing significantly better than public schools in a lot of these studies. And he also, uses these questionable control variables that can sort of, as we say, torture the data until it confesses. So whereas random assignment really disciplines the researcher. I mean, I look at the results, and those are the results, and those are what get reported. There's no sort of avenue for massaging them. So I mean, I'm just much more impressed with the gold standard studies because they're more rigorous, and it just so happens that they more consistently show positive effects for private school choice than the less rigorous studies.
All right, thank you very much. All right, now welcome to the stage, Matt Chingos. Matt.
Well, thank you to the Foundation for the opportunity to be here and talk to you all today. So, and thank you also for giving Patrick he had the hard job. So first he had to explain statistical methods for social science to all of you. And then he had to review a very substantial literature, dozens and dozens of studies of the effects of private school choice on a range of different outcomes, test scores, civic participation, integration. And the topic of my talk today is the effects of private school choice and educational attainment. By educational attainment, I mean, how far do you go in school? Do you make it out of high school? Do you go into college? Do you get a college degree? And there aren't so many studies on that. So my job is going to be a bit easier. So there's just a handful of studies. And I'm going to focus on a recent study that a colleague and I at the Urban Institute did of the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program. You're probably all thinking, well, he came and he wants to talk about his study. He must think it's the most important study. Well, no, I'm not talking about it because it's my study. I'm talking about it because it's a study of the biggest private school choice program, and it's probably more likely to be representative of what we might see going forward from some of the statewide private school choice programs that have really expanded over the last 10 years. I mean, my understanding from the folks at Ed Choice is that the number of private school choice programs has tripled. The number of students participating has increased from something like 150,000 to approaching 500,000. So just to kind of do a one-slide version of Patrick's talk to kind of set up what I'm going to talk about, most of the studies do focus on shorter-term outcomes, things like test scores, parent satisfaction, civic engagement, important outcomes to be sure. But they may not tell us everything we need to know about what happens to students in the longer run, in terms of how far they go in school, and eventually we'll be interested to know how do they do in the labor market, do they lead happy and successful lives. And that early literature found a lot of neutral and positive effects. But I think one fact that adds a little bit of color to Patrick's excellent presentation is that some of the newer research that has focused more on statewide programs has found some negative effects, at least initially. There is some evidence that they go away over time. In places like Indiana, Louisiana, Ohio, and a new study of the DC voucher program. Now, you can certainly quibble with details of some of those studies, and Patrick gave some important background on how to think about the Ohio study. But I think it has led to this concern that is there a difference between what we're going to get from private school choice in the older days when it was pilot programs like the privately funded program in New York City or relatively small programs like the DC voucher program, and the new generation of policies, which are big programs, right? Florida tax credit now has over 100,000 kids, right? You add in the special ed programs there, I think it gets you to something like 140 or 150,000. So I think there's value in both looking at these short-term outcomes, because that's what we observe right away, but when the program has been around long enough, to take a look at longer-term outcomes. Do students graduate from high school? Do they go to college? Do they graduate from college? And there aren't that many of these studies. I'm going to talk mostly about the Florida study, but the other two studies that I think are worth mentioning is one of the New York City voucher program that Paul Peterson and I did. And we found overall that kids who got a voucher were just as likely to go on to college, to graduate from college, as kids who didn't get a voucher, and that was a gold standard study, lottery study. And we found that for students of color, for African American and Hispanic students in that study, which were something like 80 or 90% of participants, there was a pretty significant positive effect on the likelihood that those students would go on to college and would graduate from college with a bachelor's degree if they got a voucher. The other important study is the evaluation of the DC voucher program, which Patrick led, which found that among students who got a voucher, once again through a lottery, gold standard study, they were more likely to graduate from high school by about 12 percentage points, really sizable impact. But New York and DC are relatively small programs in particular cities. And as a result, until this Florida study, we didn't know much of anything about the longer-term impacts of a statewide program like Florida. So that's what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about today. But when we get into Q&A, happy to take a broader look. So just to give you a quick overview of the FTC program for folks who aren't so familiar with it. Until very recently, it was limited to kids from families that would be eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So that's less than 185% of the federal poverty line. It's basically a means-tested voucher program, but they call it a tax credit scholarship program because it's funded by corporate donations that get reimbursed by corporate tax credits. It was first available in 2002-03 school year. It's now grown to be the largest program of its kind in the country. The scholarship amount has increased from $3,500 in the early years to more than $6,000 today, and in some cases parents add money to that in order to cover the tuition, or I imagine in some cases the private schools help out and make up the difference. So this chart just gives you a quick sense of how rapidly this program has grown from being a new program in the early 2000s to hitting almost 100,000 in 2016-17, and now it's past that mark. And it's the biggest program in the state. The McKay Voucher and the relatively new Gardner ESA programs, both targeted to special education students, are smaller. So the data my study are based on are, basically we got data on the FTC kids from, they're really excited about data.
They're super excited about your data.
I said data and
amazing.
They went wild, right?
But Matt, I will say you got 4 minutes.
4 minutes,
Come
okay.
on, baby.
All right, I'll go fast. So we got data from Step Up for Students on their FTC kids. We matched it to data from the Florida Department of Ed on the public school kids. And we're going to focus on the FTC kids who previously attended a public school, which is what was required in the earlier years of the program. And we're only going to observe enrollment at public colleges in Florida. It's about 80% of enrollments. I think if anything, biases it in favor of the public school kids because we have some evidence in general that private school kids are more likely to go to private colleges. Most kids leave the FTC program after a year or two, so I'm going to show you some average effects of participating. So on average, 37% of kids who participate in FTC leave the program after a year, usually return to public school. A little more than half return after a year or two, but a sizable number, say for 3, 4, 5 or more years. So my methodology is, I think what I can describe as a silver standard methodology. I'm comparing the FTC kids to a matched group of kids who didn't participate but look very similar. They're at the exact same public schools in the exact same grade, exact same year, and they had similar baseline scores, language spoken at home, race, disability, age, gender, and so on. And I'm going to show you results separately for kids who started in elementary, middle versus high school. Going into this, we thought those results might be different, but it doesn't really matter in the end. So here are the results. What this shows you is the blue bars are the college enrollment rates for that matched sample of public school kids. And the dark bars, I'm not sure if those are dark blue or black, but the dark bars are the FTC kids. And what you see is that FTC kids, regardless of when they entered the program, are about 6 percentage points more likely to enroll in college within 2 years of high school graduation than the kids who didn't participate but were similar in every other way that we can measure. And most of that effect was in the community colleges. Now, one thing to know about Florida is almost everyone who goes to college, especially low-income kids, at least starts out at what we might call a community college. In Florida, what they call a Florida State College, because they grant both 2- and 4-year degrees, but I think mostly 2-year degrees. So most of the effect of participation is on community college enrollment, less on enrollment in the university system there. Where you see bigger effects are for the kids who participate for more years in the program. So the kids who participate just 1 year, we basically see no effect. It's not significant from 0, barely anything. 2 years, bigger effect, 3 years, an even bigger effect, and the biggest effect for 4 years. So after 4 years, you see college enrollment rates for the kids who started in elementary or middle school going up by 14 percentage points. 12 of that's at community colleges, and about almost 2 of that is at universities. Similar pattern of findings for the kids who started in high school. Not much after a year, but really quite sizable effects for the kids who persist in the program. When we look at degree attainment, it's too soon to look at bachelor's degrees for these kids. Not enough time has passed. But we can look at associate degree attainment. Here, the results are less positive. They're not negative. There's just not as much going on. So the average effect is basically 0, maybe half a point on one group of kids. For the kids who stick it out, say 3 or 4 years, you start to see something. But it's not as strong. It's not nearly as positive as the enrollment effect. We look at effect by types of private school. We see some differences there. Catholic schools have some big effects. The non-Christian religious schools, the Muslim schools and the Jewish schools and some unclassified schools have some very big effects. The non-Catholic Christian schools are kind of in the middle. They kind of look like the average effect. And then the non-religious private schools have basically 0 effect. Not a negative effect, just 0 effect relative to the public schools. And then the schools where the most students are on FTC have smaller estimated effects. So if you're at a school where less than a quarter of the kids are on the scholarship, these are kind of schools we think might exist in the absence of the program. Those have the biggest effects. And the schools that look like they're a little more reliant on the program, once again, they don't have negative effects. They're just not as positive. So some quick conclusions. It looks like I have 7 seconds left, so I'll have to talk fast. We see positive effects on community college enrollment, smaller or neutral effects on 4-year enrollment and 2-year degree attainment, large effects for the multi-year participants, but most kids only stay for a year or two, so don't get those effects. And this doesn't necessarily tell us what to expect from some of these states where test score evidence is negative, places like Louisiana, Indiana, Ohio. So it'll be important to continue to study these programs. So we're doing some of that at the Urban Institute. Hopefully early next year, we'll be releasing studies on Milwaukee and DC, working with Patrick and some of his colleagues. And in Florida, we're going to try and get data from the National Student Clearinghouse so we can see private enrollment, which could change the results. And we're going to start comparing over the next few years effects of these programs on short and long-term outcomes so we can start to understand when we see a certain effect on parent satisfaction or civic values or test scores, can that tell us something about what we might expect in terms of these long-run effects? So thanks for your attention. Look forward to the discussion.
All right, there we go. Very nicely done, Matt. Let me, and they loved it too. Wow, man,
They love me.
you are killing it. You are killing it, Matt. Let me ask you a question too about the long-term impacts. I certainly think, I bet all of us would buy this argument that if you have an impact on college graduation, that is a very meaningful impact. We have lots of evidence about college graduation being related to upward mobility and lots of good outcomes. But let's ask a little bit about high school graduation and college going. You know, there was a big scandal this week in Washington, D.C., where Ballou, one of the high-poverty high schools, there was news that they had announced that every senior at Ballou has been accepted to college. And the local NPR station dug in, found out that something like a third to a half of the kids had missed months and months of their senior year because they had skipped classes, and big questions about whether they had actually, what achievement level these kids were at. They were getting high school diplomas. They were supposedly going to college, but they weren't even showing up for class, much less, actually college ready. So when we look at findings that say, school choice or anything else is having an impact on high school graduation rates or college going, I mean, should we be skeptical or am I being too cynical about that?
I mean, I think that college graduation is probably more of a uniform standard, right? We know people who graduate from college are, on average, going to do better in the labor market. They're going to make more money. Mm-hmm. Starting out at a community college and then dropping out. I mean, there is some evidence of returns to going to college but not finishing, but the biggest returns really are to finishing. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe how I would rank things is, we want to see people graduating from high school, but we worry about differences in standards, especially if we're comparing public and private schools.
Right.
What if private schools have higher standards for graduation? Mm-hmm. They might have lower graduation rates, but actually be doing better by their students. Then college enrollment, I think I see as a little bit more objective because the school didn't have as much control over that directly, right? They weren't graduating the kids. Mm-hmm. But schools can sort of nudge people into college. So I think one question to raise about the Florida results, and one reason I think we want to keep following these kids and see what happens to them, is a cynical interpretation would be that somehow private schools nudged a bunch of kids to start out at community college, mm-hmm. and then it didn't work out for them. And did that really benefit? Did they benefit from that? Or if they took on a loan, could it actually harm them somehow? So I think it's too soon to have that negative of an interpretation of the results. I don't give it that interpretation, but I think it's why we want to. I mean, ideally, we wait and find these kids when they're all 80 years old and sitting in their rocking chair on their porch and have them look back on their lives and figure out. But we have to make decisions now, right? We have to take on these issues for kids now. So it really is a matter of weighing having evidence now versus waiting until people are 100 years old to find out the whole truth.
All right, but we are coming back here, 60 years from now for that panel. I would love it. Okay.
I'll be here.
Now, please welcome Ben to the stage for our last presentation. Mention data, Ben. They'll love it.
Thanks, Mike. Whether we should do school choice or not really should depend on what it actually does. It should also depend on real life kids and real life families and how it affected them. But I'll just tell you a little bit about me. I'm a professor of economics at Kennesaw State. I'm Friedman Fellow with Ed Choice. But when I was a first-year professor in Georgia, Governor Roy Barnes had this Education Reform Commission, and so I got drafted to be on the staff, and I did that for 2 years. And then Governor Barnes lost his re-election to another guy, and that other guy asked me to be his education policy advisor. And I was just a professor, right? And so I went to Governor Barnes' people who I'd worked for, and I know a lot of Georgia people here, I won't tell you who it was, Chris Carpenter. I said, what do? I don't know how to be an education policy advisor to governor. And of course they were bitter because they had lost, right? And one of them said to me, Ben, you're gonna have your charts and your studies and your facts and your figures. And you know what? It doesn't matter because all they care about is the money. And what he meant by them was the public school lobbies. And there's a whole army of these lobbyists. And so like when I was testifying for the governor's very timid charter school bill in 2003, I would be the only one testifying for it. And then there'd be 30 people testifying against, but it was about the money. So let's talk about the money. And I want to talk about the fiscal effects of school choice on states and public school districts. All right, just to back up, how are public schools funded? They get money from the federal government, they get money from their state government, and they get money from their local government. So taxpayers at all three levels are paying for them. How are private school choice programs typically funded? Typically, they're funded only with state dollars. Right? To my knowledge, traditional public schools in the United States are the only endeavor that they get to retain funds for students they no longer serve. Right? Going back, when a child leaves a traditional public school with a voucher or an ESA, or maybe via tax credit scholarship like Florida or Georgia, typically the public schools lose the state funding. But they get to keep all their local, say, property tax revenue or other local revenues. And then federal revenues are determined basically in two ways, basically on the characteristics of the community and other complicated hold harmless things, so they don't lose the federal money either. So they get to keep the local and the federal money, but yet when they lose students via, say, vouchers or ESAs, they scream bloody murder. But they have it better than anybody else. And I'll give you an example, higher education. About this time of year, I teach intro to economics, and I pull aside the students who are really smart and did a good job in the class, and I say, I'm not pushing this on you, but you might want to think about economics as a major. It's a good major, but if you don't major in economics, major in something else really great. And I'm at Kennesaw State University, and almost every student I pull aside tells me, I'm transferring to Georgia or Georgia Tech, right? Which is obviously a terrible, terrible academic decision. All right, but when we lose a student to, say, Georgia Tech, we lose their Pell Grant funding. We lose their state formula funding. We lose their Hope Scholarship funding. We lose their tuition and fee funding. We lose it all. Georgia has a universal pre-K program. That's also a voucher system. So when a child leaves one pre-K in mid-year and goes to another one, all the money goes. It's only K-12 education that gets to retain significant funds for students they no longer serve. Right? Now, what about the fiscal effects on school districts? It's actually a bit complicated. There have been 3 studies, one by me and 2 others, and we've all found about the same thing. We tried to estimate short-run fixed and short-run variable costs of public schools. And by that we mean from one year to the next. And what we all found was roughly, it varies by state, but roughly about 2/3 of expenditures on public schools can be considered as variable costs, even one year to the next. But in the long run, all costs are variable because school districts can make different strategic decisions and things. And I'll just give you a little example, and state legislators will know exactly what I'm talking about. When there's, say, a committee hearing in the morning on the K-12 appropriations subcommittee at a state capitol, there'll be a superintendent of a local school district. He'll be male because women have too much integrity. I'm not lying, right? It'll be a male superintendent, and in your state, he'll sound like you, and in my state, he sounds like me. And what he says in Georgia is he said, I'm getting all these more students. I got to hire more teachers, got to build more classrooms, got to hire more bus drivers. So he's arguing basically all his costs are variable, so when he gets more students, he needs more funding. Then in the afternoon, there'll be a education committee subcommittee hearing on the school choice bill. It'll be the same dude, And what he'll say in that meeting is he goes, when that kid leaves with that voucher, well, number one, if only one kid was going to leave, he wouldn't be testifying against it, right? But he says, if that kid leaves that voucher, still got to pay that light bill, still got to pay that teacher, still got to pay that bus driver. So now he's arguing all his costs are fixed. Well, which is it, right? He's having it both ways when it's convenient for him, right? There's been several studies of the fiscal effects of private school choice programs on states and local school districts, and I'll just talk about two. All right, Florida, and I picked one old study, one new study, one big program, one small program. So Florida, this is a study from fiscal year 2008. Their program, as these guys just said, is huge. In fiscal year 2008, it's estimated to save the state about $39 million to state taxpayers. Oklahoma has a tiny program, and in fiscal year 2016, it saved the state about $800,000. The next bullet is a link to an Ed Choice study by my colleague Marty Lucan, where he surveys all the research on this, and you can get that. But why are these programs saving states money, and why are they saving school districts money? It's because the average scholarship amounts are below state funding per student and well below estimates of variable costs of educating students. And this is an example from Oklahoma. The fact that these programs save money, I don't think should be surprising. In fiscal year 2016, Oklahoma's public schools spent about $8,000 in change per student on their public schools. State funding was $38.85 per student, but tax credit scholarships per student were only about $23.50. So when they lose, when $23.50 in state tax money goes away because that child took a scholarship, but state funding was $3,800, and then the total funding was $8,000, right? It kind of makes sense that there's some savings to be had there. So these studies kind of pass the smell test. Now for some context. This was a study, I've done actually 3 on this, and this one was called Back to the Staffing Surge. So when we want to talk about the fiscal effects of school choice, we always kind of say compared to what, right? This is the public school system in the United States, 1992 to 2014. That was the most recent data I could get when I wrote the study. And this data comes from your State Department of Education, reports it to the US Department of Education every year. It's publicly available. Any moron can download it. Exhibit A, right? The first bar is 27%. That's the increase in inflation-adjusted spending per student in American public schools over that time period. But over that time period, average teacher salaries declined by 2%. Where'd the money go? It went to the staffing surge, which, again, if you just Google staffing surge and Ed Choice, you can find my previous studies. This has been going on since 1950, right? But here I'm just talking about the modern staffing surge. The number of students, as you can see, increased by 19% in American public schools over this time period, but the number of staff increased by 36%. And these are full-time equivalents. Who were these extra staff? I'm able to separate public school staff into 2 buckets, teachers and everybody else. So it's teachers is one bucket, everybody else is in the other bucket. Janitors, bus drivers, counselors, parapros, assistant principals, curriculum specialists, etc. You can see teachers increased by 28%, more than the increase in students. We knew that because we cut class sizes, people wanted it, we did it. But what I think people didn't know was that the all other staff was increasing at a much higher rate. And that crowded out, among other things, increases in pay for employees. Someone said yesterday in one of the panels, and I actually agree with her, I wouldn't care about this if achievement was like booming. I call this the Hanushek critique, after Eric Hanushek at Stanford University. He talks about, let's look at the macro picture, right? We're spending more money, we're adding more bodies, but at a macro level, is achievement going up? It doesn't seem to be, right? And this is just national test scores for age 17 American public schools. Reading scores kind of declined a bit, so it's basically a wash over this period. Math scores were exactly a wash, right? So I do think maybe it's time to try something different, right? Because, again, the staffing surge has been going on since 1950, right? So we know what the politics and the bureaucracy, what the outcome is going to be, adding more and more staff, right? But we've had flat test scores. I think if you can provide the same educational and social outcomes at a lower taxpayer cost, that's a clear win for choice. So sometimes when a study comes out and it's in the media, right, it says, oh, choice doesn't do any better. Well, it does no better at a way lower cost, right? That should matter, especially to state legislators and taxpayers. But I do think we should aspire to more, lower costs, but also better outcomes for students. Thank you.
Good stuff, Ben. See, I didn't have to interrupt you because, you just kept it humming. And I'm just saying, Pat, just kidding. Let me push a few things on your presentation as well. For one thing, it is interesting, to put Pat's findings on competitive effects with your findings on finances kind of makes sense. That, the critique was always that the competition from private school choice was going to take money away from public schools and they'd perform worse. Well, it turns out that it doesn't really take money away. It actually, they end up having more money. Do you think does that partly explain what's happening here?
I think that might be part of it. Yeah, if you're taking away money from public schools, that's less than the variable cost of educating that student, then the students who remain in public schools have more resources for their education. Yeah. And I'm working on a paper now about the Indiana Scholarship Program, and we're finding the effects are tiny, but that the pupil-staff ratios actually get better after some students leave via choice. But again, the effects are small. Yeah. But there's more money left.
Yeah. All right, now let me push on one other thing. You say, that this finding is because these tuition amounts are so small. And some people, I'll put myself in this group, would say, it looks like they might be too small. How the heck are you going to run a really strong program at $2,000, $3,000, even $4,000 a kid? That maybe we all agree that spending more money doesn't in the aggregate matter, but at some level, you need a certain amount of money. Certainly we see that in the charter school world. Maybe we see that in the private school choice world too, that if you try to do this on the cheap, we're not going to get the results that we need. What do you think about that?
I completely agree, but let me put my working in politics hat back on. You got to start somewhere. And I think as you get more kids on the program, you're going to get more political support for doing the right thing for kids, right? If a child is educated here and taxpayers are spending a certain amount on them, why are we spending less on them when we're educating them here? Isn't it about the children? And I think you saw the graph Matt just put up about Florida. The Florida scholarship amounts were very low at first. Now they're much better, right? What was it, $6,000 per student? That's impressive. So I think it's going to go in the right direction, but you got to start somewhere.
Okay. I'm going to have a couple questions for you guys that I have not even prepared you for. So I'm going to give you just a little time to start thinking about it. I want you to start thinking about, based on all this research we've talked about, some policy designs that you would recommend for these folks, based on the research we have. Because, of course, we've been talking about private school choice as if it's one thing, and of course it comes in lots of different shapes and sizes, tons of questions about things like how much should the scholarship amounts be for? Should these be targeted programs for disadvantaged kids or more universal? Different mechanisms to do school choice. Should there be some kind of quality control mechanisms for the schools that participate, and on and on and on. So just start thinking about that. And for you, your assignment is to start thinking about some questions that you may have, and we'll start taking them. There's one mic over here that we'll have you go to. So start thinking about your questions. Let's, again, try to think about it mostly in terms of the research and then the connection with research to policy questions that you're struggling with. All right? So who's ready to go first on the policy recommendations? Yes, Pat.
So I'm going to sound like a weaselly academic here, but I think policy design depends on what you want. What kind of an outcome for which population of students is most important to you. If you really want test score outcomes to go up for disadvantaged populations of students, then you want to target your private school choice program to them. You probably want to restrict it to the inner city. And just make it heavily targeted to those disadvantaged groups. But if you really want to create a rising tide that lifts all boats, that improves outcomes overall through competitive pressure, then you want a more broad-based program. You want a universal program, or at least a program where eligibility reaches into the middle class. So I think a lot of it sort of depends. We see enough patterns in the results so far to be able to make educated statements about the kinds of policy designs that are most likely to lead to the kinds of outcomes for different groups of students.
But so let me push on that, Pat. But you said that the biggest impacts, or the best research we have, is impacts on, for example, African American kids. Usually we're talking about low-income kids. So why not? Is there a worry that these more universal programs are not going to have positive impacts on middle-class kids. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, the African American families knew that private school choice would help them the most before we knew it. They figured it out before we did. And private school choice programs have been most popular with African American families. That is, among the eligible population, African American families disproportionately participate in these programs, more than you would expect given their numbers. White families participate less than you'd expect given their numbers, because they've usually found their way into a good public school arrangement. So I think you naturally, even as you grow and expand the eligibility for private school choice programs, you're going to just naturally bring along a lot of African American families, because they're the ones that tend to be most interested in educational alternatives for their kids.
Okay. All right, Matt, what do you think?
So I'd associate myself with Patrick's remarks and add a few more thoughts. And I preface them by saying I don't think the research really tells us much about policy design in general. So this is more kind of drawing on sort of the theory of how we'd hope for these things to work. So one, I think, thing for people designing these policies to think about is transparency. I think for a system of competition among schools and choice for families to work well, there needs to be a certain level of transparency so that families can know what they're choosing, right? That you don't have to track down someone who went to every one of the schools you might think about and try and glean from those interactions and from visiting the school. I mean, that's a whole lot of work, right? And a lot of families don't, have the resources to invest in that. So I think there's a really clear case to make for transparency. The second one where I think there's kind of a bigger question mark is around accountability, right? So some folks would make the argument that transparency is all the accountability we need. That families, once empowered with that information, will provide the accountability, because if there's transparency, they won't send their child to a school that's bad. And if they do send their child to a school that's bad, they will find out that it's bad and not send them there anymore. I think other folks would make an argument that the government's paying for this, as these aren't families' dollars, these are taxpayer dollars, they're society's dollars, and that we ought to both protect taxpayer investments, and we also sort of be in sort of a consumer protection role. Right? The FDA doesn't tell you whether to take Tylenol or Advil, but they tell you that we're not going to allow on the market some pill that markets itself as being like Tylenol or Advil, but it's going to kill you. Right? So there's an idea of, well, then how do we set some kind of accountability bar where we say there's a line we're going to draw and schools that fall below it can't participate, right? And that introduces trade-offs that policymakers have to think about, which is if I set that bar really high, I'm going to keep out the good schools and the bad schools. If I set it low, I'm going to let in the good schools and the bad schools. So how do you set it so that you get in as many good schools as possible and keep out bad schools if you think that's an appropriate role for the government to play?
All right, good. Ben?
I agree with all that. I have just two things to add. About segregation, I think we have learned something from the research, actually, that if you make schools homogeneous through government regulation, and then you give everyone the same voucher amount, that's going to increase segregation, just like what's going on in our traditional public schools now. We've equalized spending to a large degree in this country, not perfectly equal. We've homogenized schools through things like standards, testing, et cetera. And we've had an increase in segregation by race, and especially by income in American public schools, while American neighborhoods have become more racially integrated since 1980. So I think if we're going to do school choice, I think that can help improve the segregation issue by giving lower income kids, for example, much bigger vouchers or much bigger scholarships. And then if we let schools be different, it'll give people another reason to sort, right? What's going on is people are moving into the neighborhood. Public schools are not free to the consumer. You've got to be able to afford to live in that neighborhood. So what people with money are doing is, what's the best school I can find that has the best peers that I can afford to live in? And so that screens out disadvantaged people from those neighborhoods. So I think bigger vouchers to low-income kids will help ameliorate that and let schools be different, which is my second point, kind of piggybacking off what Matt just said. I'm against the consumer protection business under a choice program. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, sounds great. They kill a lot of people by not letting drugs get to market as fast as perhaps they should be. and there's a lot of research, they kill more people than they save. And I think there's a metaphor here. And if I could tell one quick story. I was the first chair of our Charter Schools Commission in Georgia, and so it was allowed the state to approve them. The first school that came across to the state commission had been approved locally in Clayton County, Georgia. They were the first school district to lose accreditation since 1969. This is about 6-7 years ago. And they had approved this charter school. 5 years later, they had voted to close them. So they were appealing to us. They were the only charter school that had the cheating scandal in Georgia, erasing answers. They had financial mismanagement. They had governance, was terrible, right? So why would we keep them open? So of course we voted 7-0 to close it. But I got an email from almost every single parent at that school, and they were illiterate. It wasn't AstroTurf at all. And pretty much every one of those parents was saying, yeah, we know this school isn't great, but it's a hell of a lot better than Clayton County Public Schools. At least it's safe, and at least the teachers care. Who am I to vote to close that school? I think we're spending too much time on closing schools. The answer to there would have been more choice, not less.
Okay. Who has a question out there? Please head on over to this microphone and ask it. While I'm waiting for that, I'll ask you guys one more. You don't all have to answer it. But we've talked a lot about private school choice versus public schools. What about charter schools? I'm often at places where people will say, and they'll say, well, clearly the research shows that charter schools are more effective than vouchers. What do you say to that statement?
All right, well, I'll jump in here because I study both forms of choice. I think if you look at the broad literature, the evidence is somewhat more consistent that private school choice increases test scores for kids. The charter school area, it's a lot more context dependent. There are certain charter school networks that promote what's called academic press, and that's basically, they declare we are all about improving test scores. And that's what their school culture is about, that's what their curriculum is about, and there have been lots of studies that show that those charter schools get dynamite outcomes, test score outcomes for kids. But there are other charter schools that are like credit recovery, dropout prevention, that are themed towards civic values, that have sort of racial pride themes, and basically with the charter schools, you kind of get what their program is. Whatever their program is oriented towards, that's what you get. But you get a lot more variation in terms of the test score outcomes because not all charter schools are really focused on that. So there's greater diversity in the outcomes in the test score field for charters than for voucher programs.
Yeah, everybody agree with that? All right, let's hear, tell us who you are and ask your question. Yeah.
Jordan Posmentier from the Committee for Children. Two quick questions. One is about the comparison groups you're using to measure against the private schools. Are charters included in those comparison groups? And then the second question is, in terms of comparative analysis, we see the positive returns on private schools by all those studies that were shown up on the screen. How do those rank in terms of other mechanisms in policy world, anywhere from dual language programs, or are the returns on this the right lever for lawmakers to pull?
Oh, that's interesting. So say compared to preschool or compared to other things you might invest money in.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll take your second question first. How big are these effects? They tend to be around 15 to 30% of a standard deviation on the achievement side. They're higher on the attainment side for the most part. They're somewhat higher on the attainment side. They are sort of in the range of what we've seen from class size reduction, where the results aren't quite as consistent as they are for voucher or choice programs. But the size of the effects are similar to what we see in class size reduction. In terms of pre-K, there really isn't a strong research consensus on pre-K yet. I mean, for every study that shows a positive effect, there are very rigorous studies that show no effect or even negative behavioral effects. So I don't think the pre-K literature is sufficiently rich and settled for us to really compare. Some of the hothouse programs showed huge effects, but that was 50 years ago. Yep. And so they're pretty close to what we find. I guess another way to put it in context is Mark Lipsey at Vanderbilt University, just down the road here, did a meta-analysis of the average effect of any kind of educational intervention that was evaluated using experimental methods. So what is the, when we're doing anything that we think is going to improve education, what is the average test score outcome we'd expect? And he found at the elementary level, it's 8% of a standard deviation. So about half of what we get from a private school choice intervention. At the middle school, it's 5% of a standard deviation, and at high school, it's 2% of a standard deviation, because it's really hard to move kids in test scores at the high school level. So school choice, private school choice, is producing positive test score gains that are about twice the average effect of any education intervention we've ever tried and evaluated.
Okay.
On your second question,
Sorry,
you want
I just want to add a little bit to that, which is that the other thing you have to think about is the cost side. So, right, usually when we estimate these effects, we then want to compare them. Well, how much bang for your buck do you get if you're doing class size versus pre-K versus teacher salaries versus whatever? But the cost benefit here is weird because these choice programs tend to save money. So, I mean, it's kind of Ben point. If you're getting the same outcomes at worst, or better outcomes in many cases, for less money, well, that's the kind of thing you should just do. Because it's not like, I mean, you could do that and save money and then also reduce class size. So it's not should we do school choice or reduce class size, what should we do with the savings from school choice? Should we use it to reduce class size? I mean, those programs have to deal with it, and that is the right way to think about those programs, right? It's $1 on class size worth more than $1 on pre-K or teacher salaries or intensive tutoring or a new curriculum or what have you.
Good.
With school choice, it saves money.
That other question, are charters in most of these studies? I guess probably
Right.
some and not in others?
It depends on the research design. If it's a random assignment study and it's in an urban environment, you can bet that a lot of the students in the control group are actually exercising school choice. They're in charter schools. So we're not comparing choice versus no choice. We're generally comparing the opportunity to add private school choice to whatever existing choice already is there in the community. What's the incremental benefit of that? So it just underscores the inherent conservatism of these random assignment studies. It's not comparing students in private schools to students in traditional public schools. It's including students who participate in a choice program with students who have every other option except participating in that choice program.
I think it's important to distinguish between those two kinds of studies, right? Some studies really are head-to-head studies of how do kids in charters do versus public schools? How do kids in private schools do versus public schools? Whereas some studies are of choice policies, right? The study that you led, Patrick, of the DC voucher program was a study of this policy that's layered on top of these other things, right? So I think it's important to distinguish those things because sometimes it matters. Sometimes those things are different.
Okay, yes.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm actually an owner of a private school here in Tennessee, and we have really worked hard to create a diverse curriculum that's more individualized for our students. And as a private school owner that's very passionate about individualized learning, some of the things that I've run into is being able to provide the assessment data that aligns with my unique learning environment for my students. I'm an advocate for accountability when it comes to schools because at the end of the day, like you said, there are schools that are failing, and without that data, how do you improve? My concern for programs like mine that are so passionate about being able to create environments that are accepting of all learning styles is there going to be accountability measures that align with those different learning styles? I don't feel like in Tennessee we have standardized testing that's one size fits all, and we've created a totally different concept in our program, and we don't feel like that data accurately depicts the education of our schools. What is your opinion on kind of creating a more progressive variance as a means of assessing students that align with those learning styles?
So I think this is a really great question. It's a really important issue, right? I mean, we have states for their public schools set standards. They have tests that are aligned to measure whether students are meeting those standards. And it's like in third grade, you're going to learn this. We're going to test at the end of third grade. Fourth grade, you're supposed to learn this. You're going to test at the end of fourth grade. So in a lot of these big statewide studies of Louisiana, Ohio, and Indiana, it's kids in the private schools taking this test that was designed for the public schools. right? So I mean, maybe, so it could be that the schools are very different like your school, or it could just be that a private school is teaching something in 4th grade, the public school is teaching 5th grade, and things are just kind of getting moved around. So that's when you talk about transparency, as I did before, and you want to, let's say, have private schools test kids and publish the scores, well, on what test?
Right.
Right? So, I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer to this question. I mean, on one hand, I'm not sure you want to say, well, pick a test that's testing what you're doing, because maybe parents want to know something about what you're doing, but that's one direction you could go. The other direction you could go is to try and say, well, we expect all schools to try and hit some minimum standard. So yeah, your school is creative in all these ways, and it's going to be different in a lot of ways, maybe on the kind of more advanced skills. But your kids should still be able to read and do basic arithmetic, right?
Right.
So if you are taking kids and by the 3rd grade they can't read, well, then that's bad,
Right.
So it could just be that we want to focus on certain skills that we all agree are universal, but that's going to be different from a state test, which naturally we want to not just test those skills, but also to test more challenging skills.
Right. Sorry.
So I agree with much of what my colleague says, but I have a stronger position in terms of the tests that private schools should be required to administer to choice students. I think they should be able to choose the test, to choose whatever credible norm reference tests that they think is best aligned with their curriculum, or the state test, if they think that's best aligned with their curriculum. Because otherwise, I think, they're one of two problems. Either you're going to have a skewed view of how effective a private school is if it has a distinctive curriculum, or you're going to force that school to abandon its distinctive curriculum, and then you get the homogenization that Ben mentioned, and school choice no longer has a foundation for the choosing.
Right.
So Pat, do you think traditional public schools and charter schools should get that same deal? That let them choose their test too?
Well, that's...
I support that. Under a choice system, I support that.
Sure. If there's
100%.
a very robust school choice program, I think every school that receives public funds should be allowed to choose the test that they think best aligns with their curriculum. And then for evaluation purposes, you can use these procedures called concordance processes, where you can equate performance on one test with performance on a different test. It'll just require that you pay people like us a lot of money.
Right.
I strongly
have also
support
been through that. So,
All right, good. I want to get to this last question if we can, okay? Because we're almost out of time. But the answer is heads, Pat wins, and tails, Pat wins. So that's good. Okay.
Love it.
Well,
Yes.
thank you very much. Steve Roberts, State Board of Education of Kansas. And when people who know I'm in the education business, maybe with small children, they have a 3 or a 4-year-old, and they say, Roberts, where should we put our kids? Public, private, parochial, what should we look at? I have the same answer for everyone. Go where the better teachers are. That's it, right? If the better teachers are found in your local private school, go there. Local public school, go there. If you have a great teacher in the home, homeschooling is a really great option. But if you don't have a good teacher in the home, for God's sakes, don't homeschool. Right? So with that as a background, my life has become talking points as we work on our moonshot in Kansas. Hopefully you'll be hearing more about that soon. I have 2 talking points I want to run by you. And
All right,
get
but
your
just to say, sir, we have 2 minutes until we got to shut down this panel.
2 talking points. 1, we should stop labeling children by race because it's the right thing to do. I'd like to get your feedback on that. And the other is we should eliminate the federal free and reduced lunch program and replace it with lunch. You send your kids to school, we feed them. Simple as that.
Okay.
Can I get your feedback, please?
I'll take the second one, and I will hand off the first one
want the second one.
to my colleague at the Urban Institute. I agree completely about school lunch, and I was the president of a local school board, a parochial school board, and we pulled out of the federal lunch program because of all the regulations, and we basically raised private funds to support the students who were the free lunch students in our school, and basically we were able to deliver a nutritious menu at lower cost because we weren't in the federal lunch program. The federal lunch program just has really serious problems. So I would definitely support a situation where lunch is just part of what schools deliver, and they have pretty wide parameters in terms of the content and quality of the lunches that they give. So I would definitely support number 2. Number 1.
All right, so Matt, now you have no free lunch data to look at, and you have no race data to look
I want to
at.
add something about number 2,
Yeah.
which is that in a lot of ways we're already moving in this. The federal program's moving in the direction of giving it to everybody, right? They put in rules in place where over the last couple decades, the share of kids in poverty in the country has barely changed. I mean, it moves up and down with the economy, but it's similar to what it was 20 years ago. But the share of, it's like half of the kids now are in the program because the federal government has made it easier, I think with good intentions, for a school that's a certain percentage of kids who can be what's called directly certified, meaning they're eligible for other programs, can get it, then they give it to everybody. So I think it's a direction we're already moving in, and so not obvious why we should not just go all the way there. On the first question, I guess as a researcher, representing the research lobby here today, I mean, we want to know as much about kids as we can, and I think it is worth documenting achievement gaps across groups of students defined in different ways, and especially if we're not going to have any information on the economic background of children. Seems knowing about the racial background is important, and we also have evidence that even for kids of a given income background, that there are troubling disparities by race. So, I mean, I guess I agree in some philosophical sense. I'm not sure labeling kids, I'm not sure what that means, but in terms of collecting information so that we can track progress on important problems, I would want to keep being able to do that.
Please thank our wonderful panel today.